Thank you so much for coming out on a rainy day. It's a delight to be back here in the Geological Lecture Hall, where I have many fond memories from many different phases of my life. So with that, let's get to cats. All right, many of my friends and colleagues are surprised when they learn that I have written a book on cats, because I have spent my entire career studying lizards and other reptiles. And that started from a very young age when I was fascinated first with dinosaurs. This is actually me with an anolis lizard that I spent my career studying anolis lizards, and here it goes back to age 10. But at the same time that I was fascinated with reptiles, I was also falling for cats. This is our first family cat, Tammy. We adopted her from a rescue shelter when I was 5, gave Tammy to my father for a birthday present. 2 years later followed Marisha, another rescue Siamese, and ever since then I have been gaga about cats. However, as my career developed studying reptiles, it never occurred to me, didn't give a thought at all to the idea of doing anything scientific with cats. And there were 2 reasons for this. One reason is that I wanted to go out into nature and observe animals as they go about their daily lives. And if you have ever tried to follow a cat around, you know how impossible it is. And so they just didn't seem like good study subjects. In addition, I was under the impression that there was no interesting research being done on domestic cats. Well, 12 years ago, I suddenly learned that I was completely mistaken about that second point, and that in fact there was a lot of interesting research on domestic cats using all the latest cutting-edge techniques that I use with lizards and colleagues used with chimpanzees and hippos and lions and everything else. Things like radio tracking and DNA analysis and isotopic studies and so on. So there was a lot of interesting science. And then I had what I humbly submit was a brilliant idea. I would teach a freshman class called The Science of Cats, and I would lure the students in on their love of cats and then teach them how we study nature, how we study biodiversity, just using cats as the vehicle. And so this was while I was here at Harvard, and I taught a freshman seminar, and it was, I think, very successful. Here are some of the things we did. I got students up before the crack of dawn to go down to Dorchester to visit a colony of cats, homeless cats that people were taking care of. I mean, imagine getting freshmen up at 5 in the morning, or more likely, they just didn't go to bed. But we met in Harvard Square at 5 a.m. We went to a cat show on Cape Cod, went to the Fogg Art Museum, where one of the curators gave us a lecture on cats in art. We went just up the street over there to the Semitic Museum, where the curator gave us a lecture on Egyptology and the cat's role in Egypt, and so on. And it was a great class and great fun. And so it wasn't much of a leap from teaching that class to writing a book on cats for the general public with the same theme of letting people know how we know what we know about cats and how we go about studying nature. And so that's what I did. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, the science of cats, the past, present, and future of cats, and how these topics are studied. So let's start with the title of the book, The Cat's Meow, their signature feature. Now, everyone who has lived with a cat knows that cats will meow to you. They are clearly trying to communicate something. I always assumed that cats meow to each other to communicate, and that by meowing to us, they were including us in their social network, treating us as honorary cats, if you will. But it turns out that's not correct. People who have studied colonies of cats living together have discovered that they actually rarely meow to one another, except mothers and their kittens. But beyond that, they don't meow. They do make other sounds. They hiss, they growl, and they certainly communicate with gestures and behavior, but they don't meow to each other very much. And after I learned this, I paid attention to my cats at home, and it's true. They don't meow to each other. So that raises a number of questions, and the first question is, well, did the meow evolve during domestication? Is it something that evolved as cats started hanging out specifically with us? Well, one way to answer that question is to ask, do other species of cats meow? And so to investigate that possibility, I did what all good scientists do. I went to the internet. And here are some examples. This is a bobcat. It's a meow. A little guttural, but it's a meow. All right, or how about this one, a wonderful species called the serval. Yep, they meow. In fact, all small species of cats, and even a couple of the larger ones like the cheetah, they all meow. So that then in turn leads to some more questions. Has the meow of the domestic cat changed during domestication compared to its ancestor? And then again, people who've lived with cats know that they have multiple meows, and they use them in different contexts. And so what are they trying to tell us? What is the meaning of different meows? Well, these questions were addressed by a then graduate student at Cornell University, Nicholas Nicastro. And Nicholas supplied these photos, and I think this one here tells you something about the kind of individual he is. And one of the things that was great about writing this book was contacting people like Nicholas, who were just so generous in telling me their stories, how it is that they came to be cat scientists. And it turns out almost no one sets out to be a cat scientist. It's just a random fluke series of events that leads them to that science. And so Nicholas studied this question. And the first question is, has the domestic cat's meow evolved from that of its ancestor? Well, that begs the question, what is the cat's ancestor? Here is the answer. It's the African wildcat. A little bit later in the talk, I'll tell you how we know that. Take my word for it for a while. But one thing I'd like to point out is, I think that if you saw one of these guys walk in front of you as you walked here today, your first thought would not be, what is an African wildcat doing in Harvard Yard? But it would be, what an interesting looking cat. I've never seen one quite like it. In other words, the African wildcat is very similar to domestic cats. They have changed very little. And this is a theme we'll get back to later. Well, to study this question, Nicastro went halfway around the world to the Pretoria Zoo in South Africa, where they had a lot of African wildcats, and he recorded their meows. And then he also recorded meows of domestic cats, and he compared them. And they were actually very easily distinct. The African wildcat has a call that when you play it to people and ask them just for their opinion, it comes across as much more urgent and demanding, kind of meow. Whereas the domestic cat's much more pleasant to our ears, higher frequency, more of a meow. And so if you have people put on headphones and play them the meows, and you don't tell them which is which, they always rate the domestic cat's meow as more pleasing to the ear. And what that suggests is that during domestication, cats have evolved a difference in their meow in a way that presumably makes them more appealing to us, or that lets them manipulate us more. So that's one way that the African wildcat has changed while living with us. Now, that second question about variation in the cat's meow, is it meaningful? Well, the second part of Nicastro's thesis examined that question. And to do that, he visited a number of friends' houses that had cats, and he recorded each cat meowing in the same set of circumstances. That is, each cat, well, here are the circumstances. A content cat on a lap being petted, a cat that was confined to a space that it didn't want to be in, usually a closed door, a cat that was about to be fed, one that was in an unfamiliar space, specifically Nicastro's car, and one that was aggravated by being brushed backwards. So he got each cat to meow in all 5 of those circumstances. And the meows that they produced were different. Each cat differed its meow in each circumstance. However, when you looked across all the cats, there were no similarities. Cats that were happy did not all meow in the same way. And cats that were about to be fed, again, did not have the same meow. And when people were played back these meows, again in headphones, they were played a meow and said, which one do you think it is? And people say, well, I think it's about to be fed. It was no better than guessing. People did not recognize what those meows meant, which is a bit of a puzzle, until another scientist named Sarah Ellis repeated the study with one twist. The people who listened to the meows, again, it was a random set of usually college students and others, but it also included the person who lived with that cat. And it turned out the person who lived with that cat was very good at saying, Oliver does not like being in the room alone, or Jasmine is unhappy that you're brushing her backwards. And so, in other words, people who live with cats are able to tell you what those meows mean. And it suggests that there is a private language that develops between each person who lives with a cat and the cat themselves. And that presumably is a trick that has been picked up during the domestication process. Although frankly, it hasn't, how this actually happens has not been studied. It would be an interesting topic to see how the person and the cat actually negotiate that, or how they get to know what these different meows mean. Well, now let's switch to the other major sound that cats are famous for. And that, of course, is purring. And again, the first question is, do other species purr? Here's the answer, another serval. Absolutely. Again, all small species of cats purr. The large species like the lion, the tiger, and so on, they do not purr because their vocal structure, the vocal cord structure is different. They're able to roar, but not able to purr. Well, once again, those of you who, boy, that's going on forever. All right. Those of you who live with cats, again, probably know that cats have multiple purrs. And in particular, they have one purr that when you're stroking the cat, a very, very soothing purr, purr. But they have a second purr, essentially, when they want something. Picture, for example, you're in the kitchen, you're opening a can of wet food, and little Leo is rubbing against your legs and has this very loud, urgent sort of purr, kind of chainsaw like brr, brr, brr. So people, I think many of you probably recognize that. Well, another British ethologist, Karen McComb, decided to study that. And so what she did was, first she again got people to interact with their cats and just had them sitting in their laps, petting them, and got them to do what's called the contentment purr. It's kind of a soothing, yes. And then she tried to get them to do what we call the solicitation purr. And the way she did that was very clever. She found people who the first thing they did in the morning when they got up was feed the cat. That is a really bad idea. Cats are really smart, and they quickly know that to get fed, they need to get you up. So taking these people, what she did was she said, when your alarm goes off in the morning, stay in bed. And then she put a recording device right next to the people's head. And sure enough, the alarm goes off. A minute or two later, the cat jumps on the bed, positions itself right next to the person's head, and starts this loud solicitation purr. And here it is again. Or here it is. You hear the difference? Quickly, I'll do it one more time. Contentment purr. Oops. Solicitation purr. So McComb did a fancy computer analysis, an audio spectrogram of the sounds. And as you can see, there's a clear difference, a much higher, louder peak in the solicitation purr on the far left of the graph, which is a very low frequency, the deep sound, in other words. Deep and loud is very clearly the difference between the two purrs. I thought this paper at this point was a really very nice study detailing in great detail these differences. But then she said something that I was a little dubious of. She said, this peak here, this high peak at low frequencies, that's the same peak that occurs in a human baby crying. And so her claim was that basically cats are manipulating us because we are very sensitive to the sound of a baby crying. We're innately responsive to that. And so they have embedded in their purr when they want something, a sound that we innately respond to. This seemed like it was going a little bit far. I was a little dubious of that. But what they did, the authors of the paper, is they included some audio files in their paper that you could listen to. And so I listened to the solicitation purr again, and I think I could hear a baby crying. So I'm going to let you listen to it one more time, and I'm going to ask you, do you hear a baby crying? Who thinks they hear a baby crying? This is kind of typical when I ask this question. Half the audience says yes, half the audience says no. So I'll leave it to you to decide. Obviously a topic that could use more research, but I think it is clear that cats have evolved their communication methods in ways to interact with us, something that has occurred in just the last few thousand years. And so this is one way that cats have evolved. Are there other behaviors that have changed? And there are some good candidates, we might think, things that cats do that would seem to be not ancestral, things that would have evolved after they associated with people. Things like sitting in boxes, chasing laser points, responding to catnip, making biscuits, or bringing toys to play. So let's think about these things. First, sitting in boxes. Do other species sit in boxes? Yes, they do. What about chasing laser points? Well, here's a tiger, and he does the same thing as a domestic cat, maybe a little more stately, a little slower, but there he goes. And the internet is full of all kinds of cat species doing this. How about responding to catnip? This is Winston. He's one of the cats I live with, showing you typical behavior. There's lots of interesting science around catnip, but I won't get into that now. But what about, do other felines respond to catnip? Yep, they sure do. So none of those things are traits that evolved during domestication. They're an ancestral trait for felines. Now, making biscuits, or what's more technically known as kneading, is a little bit of a different story. This is the trait that many of you may experience where a cat goes in kind of a trance and goes like this on your stomach or a blanket. In fact, here's a video. And the stomach that's being kneaded is in this room, but I won't tell who that stomach is. And so this is actually something that kittens do when they're nursing from their mother. And this rhythmic pushing is thought to be a way to stimulate the flow of milk. And so as far as we know, wild cats do not do this, wild species of cats, although no one's really studied it, but there aren't many records of it. So this may be a trait that the domestic cat picked up during domestication, basically extending the behavior that they exhibited during kittenhood to adults and directing it at humans. Finally, one last one, well, there's one more after this, bringing toys to play. And this I'm going to illustrate with the cat I live with named Nelson. And here he is. He is bringing a toy to me. And here he comes. And drops it at my feet and says, "Let's play." And it turns out if I pick it up and throw it back down the hallway, he goes running after it, gets it, and brings it back time and time again. And I did not teach him this. He just started doing it. Now, when this first happened, I was blown away. I had never heard of cats doing something like that. And I thought, Nelson is the most amazing cat in the world, which actually he is, but perhaps not for this reason. I had great thoughts of, having the Nelson YouTube channel and going on the Today Show and whatever. But then I thought, well, maybe I should just check this out. And so I, again, did my major research approach. I went on Google or YouTube, and it turns out there are videos all over the place. And in fact, you may have read, there was a research paper that was recently published in the last few weeks on this topic. And it turns out about 20% of cats exhibit this behavior. Now, there's no research on this in any other species. I've asked zookeepers. No one has told me that they do that. It's hard. It seems unlikely that if you had a lion for some reason, that you threw something, it would chase it, or it seemed more like it would eat you. But I think this might be something that has evolved during cats associating with humans, but we really don't know. So as you can see, there are a few behaviors that may reflect their evolution during the domestication process, but not a lot. But there is one really important one, and it has to do with their tails, and particularly the fact that they stick their tails up in the air like this. Despite this guy looking a little bit mean, this is actually a very friendly gesture that when cats approach other cats or people with friendly intentions, they stick their tail up, and it's thought to be a signal of, I come in peace. And just to show you how this happens, this is Archie. I'm calling him over. He's approaching me in my basement. We get closest, he winks, and up goes the tail. And so people actually, some scientists had a very clever way to test how cats respond to this. And it took advantage of something that I did not know. And that is, if you show a cat a silhouette on a wall, it will initially respond as if it's a real cat. That the first time they see it, now they quickly learn that trick, but you can show a cat something the first time it's ever seen a silhouette, and it will respond as if it's a cat. So what they did is they showed a bunch of cats this, And the cats, when they saw that, would stick up their tails and approach usually. Or they showed the same silhouette but with the tail down. And in that case, cats approached much less quickly and didn't raise their own tails. So it seems to be clear evidence that this is, in fact, a sign of friendliness, a greeting to say, I come in peace, let's be friends. Well, interestingly, this is clearly a trait that has evolved during domestication because no other feline species exhibits this behavior, except for one. Would anyone like to guess which other feline has this very similar behavior? Yes?
Palis's cat, or my favorite type of cat.
Palis's cat are great cats, but they're not reported to do this. Yes?
Oh, right, yeah, they're very grumpy.
They are grumpy. That's exactly it. Yeah. Cheetahs, good guess as well, another great species, but no, they don't do it either. I'll get one more guess, anyone? Yes? African wildcat? No. The answer is lions. Lions also exhibit this behavior, and you might think that domestic cats and lions are an unlikely pair of species to do this, but it turns out there's a very good reason, and it illustrates probably the most significant evolutionary change that domestic cats have experienced during the domestication process. So let's talk about lions for a minute. As you probably know, they live in groups called prides. Now, prides are composed of related females, a grandmother, her daughters, their daughters, and so on. And the reason for that is that as the males grow up, they leave and go elsewhere, but the females usually stay put. And so they're all related. And female lionesses in a pride are extremely social and friendly with each other. They groom each other, they play with each other, they just lie on top of each other. Females will nurse each other's young. They're a very social species. And the reason they do that, there's a lot of discussion about why they do that. It's probably a function of there being a lot of food around. And when there's a lot of food, there's a benefit to having a big group that can defend a territory so that you can take advantage of that food and other lions can't. And so if you think about lions out on the plains of the Serengeti, lots of things to eat, there's a real advantage to being group living. Well, it turns out that cats also are much more social than people give them credit for. And that in particular, when cats live in high density situations, they are very social just like lions. So what sort of situations are we talking about? Well, places where there's lots of food. Now, these days, that's often in cities where well-meaning people feed the unowned stray cats, leading to big population booms of the cats, but also in fishing villages where every day the scraps from the fisher people get thrown out and the cats can be at very high populations, or on farms sometimes. And so people have studied cats there, and they have a very similar social structure to lions. They form into groups of related individual females, and these females are very friendly to each other. They groom each other, they lay on top of each other. Not only do they nurse each other's kittens if they're born at the same time, but they'll even assist in kitten birth. So they're a very social animal in exactly the same way that lions are. I should point out that in some of these areas, there are huge numbers of cats, and they form into groups that kind of space themselves out. And so the cats are friendly to their own group, but cats over here not related to them, not friendly at all. And in fact, there's a lesson from this that cats essentially have a rule of thumb. If I've known another cat my entire life, be friendly to it. If it's a newcomer I've never met, don't be friendly. And that's why it's so difficult sometimes to introduce new cats together if you have one and then you bring in another one. So if you want to have multiple cats, it's really much better to get them as litter mates. But being that as it may, there is one major difference between lions and domestic cats in their social living. And that is that lions are known to hunt cooperatively, and they can take down very big prey as a result of that. Fortunately, domestic cats do not do this. I mean, picture them going after groundhogs and raccoons or who knows what else. Well, with that, let's now switch to the second part of the talk, which is cats of the past, the present, and the future. And we'll start with the past. The very first feline known from the fossil record goes back 30 million years. It's the species Proilurus lemonensis. And the interesting thing about this cat is, based on this reconstruction, if you saw it, you would think, no, It's a cat. This is not a missing link or a halfway cat. The first fossil cat was basically a cat. Its legs were a little short. There were some differences in its teeth and so on. But cats have not changed. They appear as they are in the fossil record, and they've pretty much stayed the same ever since, with some variation. And of course, differences in size. So 30 million years cats have been around. A big event in cat evolution occurred 20 million years ago when the cat lineage split into two groups, the saber-toothed cats and what are called the conical-toothed cats, all the cats that are alive today. Now, you've probably heard of saber-toothed cats. Certainly you have if you've seen Ice Age, which at least I'm sure the younger members of the audience have seen. The largest cat ever known was the South American saber-toothed cat, Smilodon populator, which weighed perhaps half a ton. I mean, that is a pretty big cat. People don't know, however, that a slightly smaller species, the North American saber-toothed cat, was around until about 10,000 years ago. This is a scene from the La Brea tar pits in Southern California, in basically what is now Los Angeles. 10,000 years ago, it looked like the Serengeti, and there were saber-toothed cats there. In fact, our ancestors not that long ago lived with saber-toothed cats. So during the 20 million years since the cats broke into these two groups, if you look at the fossil record, for most of that time, saber-toothed cats were much more abundant and common than the other types of cats, which include the ancestors of today's cats. They were more abundant in terms of total number of fossils, in terms of number of species. And recently, the saber-toothed cats went extinct. And we don't know why they went extinct. The larger ones probably perished because we killed off all the big things like the mammoths that they ate. But there were also not so big saber-toothed cats, and they too disappeared, leaving the world to the conical-toothed cats that we have today. But it does make you think, what if it had gone the other way around? What if the saber-toothed had survived and the others hadn't? Would we now today have saber-toothed house cats? I personally think it's a great idea, but yes, they do. That's correct. So let's talk about the cats that do live today. This is an evolutionary tree based on DNA analysis. What it indicates is that the ancestor of all of today's living species probably lived about 11 million years ago. And then it diversified into the 42 species that live today. Now, of these 42 species, 9 are what we call the big cats. These are the stars of the cat world. They have their own week on National Geographic Channel, and everyone knows lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, and so on. What everyone does not know, however, are the other 33 species, the small species. For example, here are 2 of them, the ocelot and the bobcat. And other than the young man who knows the Pallas cat, can any of the rest of you name other small cat species? Just yell them out. Serval, yes. Pallas's cat. Margay, very good. All right, you fishing cat, you guys are doing pretty well. Enough. But there are a lot of cats that no one has ever heard of. The Ancilla, the marbled cat, the Andean cat, rusty spotted cat, and so on. There are a lot more that you haven't heard of. It turns out that Asia, Africa, and South America are full of these small cat species, most of which are not well known to science, much less to the general public. And that then leads to the question, which I've already answered, but pretend I hadn't, of which of these species is the ancestor of the domestic cat? In theory, any of them could be. Well, it has long been considered, as I told you, that the wild cat was the ancestor, and that reason being that they look so similar. They're almost hard to distinguish in some cases. And I do want to emphasize the wild cat is a specific species. It's not just a wild cat. It's Felis sylvestris. Unfortunate name, but that's the way it is. Well, DNA analysis confirms this idea. Here's that same tree. If we look at this box here, we can see that the domestic cat and the wild cat are closest relatives to each other. So it confirms that idea based on anatomy. But that doesn't answer the question entirely, because we still have the question, which wildcat? There's a European wildcat, an African wildcat, an Asian wildcat. Which one was the ancestor? Well, that question was tackled by an American graduate student at Oxford, Carlos Driscoll. And what Driscoll did is he went around the world to collect samples of wildcats, little bits of tissue that he could get DNA from. And he had some great adventures. For example, here he is in Western Mongolia visiting some Kazakh eagle hunters, and they had made a coat out of 40 cat skins. Now, that doesn't sound very nice, but this is what they have to do where they live. In any case, not only did he get to model this coat, but he was able to take a little bit of a sample from the inside of each of those 40 cats and get a great representation. So he came up with an evolutionary tree of wildcats, shown here, and there were a number of surprises. First, it was not realized, but the African wildcat is actually two distinct forms, that they are genetically quite different, the North African wildcat and the South African wildcat. In addition, there's this animal here, the Chinese mountain cat, a beautiful creature, not well known. It had long been thought to be related to wildcats, but this evolutionary tree says it is a wildcat, that the Asian wildcat is more similar to the Chinese mountain cat than it is to any of the others. So in fact, there aren't 3 wildcats, there are 5 of them. And here is the geographic distribution of these 5 types, just so you can figure out where they are on the map. So back to the question, where does the domestic cat come from? Well, in theory, one idea is it comes from Europe, where they are the most similar looking. On the other hand, it could be North Africa, which geographically might make the most sense. Or maybe it's all 5. Maybe it was domesticated simultaneously in very different regions, which is perhaps true of dogs. It's also true of some other domesticated animals being domesticated in multiple different localities. Well, Driscoll's work answered this question as well. It was very clearly the North African wildcat that is the ancestor of the domestic cat. Their DNA is almost indistinguishable. There are a few differences, but not very many at all. This, of course, makes a lot of sense in terms of human history and geography, because this region includes what sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, the place where civilization really first began, where people settled down, abandoned their hunter-gatherer ways, and civilization started. And so here's a recreation of what such villages might look like, where they're starting to use agriculture to grow crops. And undoubtedly, as farmers do today, they grew as much food as they could and stored the excess in perhaps a hut like this. Well, you can imagine if you're having a hut full of grain or corn or whatever, you're going to attract a lot of rats and mice. And in turn, one can well imagine that some African wildcats, North African wildcats, took advantage of this bounty of prey and started hanging around the village so that they could eat them. Now, in recent years, scientists have realized that they've begun to study the personality of wild animals. I mean, just as everyone in this room has personality differences, what we're discovering, not very surprising really, is that animals have different personalities too. And so you could imagine that is the most, if I can anthropomorphize, the boldest wildcats would be the ones who are okay going into the village and being around people, those that are less intimidated, whereas the scaredy cats would stay away. And those bold ones would get the benefit of getting more food to eat, presumably having more offspring. And if these traits were genetically based, it would evolve so that this section of the population would become even bolder and bolder. Now, in turn, the story goes, people would see the advantage of having these cats around eating their prey, and they would be nice to them. Maybe they'd put out a bowl of milk, which really isn't so good for cats, or something else, or let them into the hut where it's warm and dry. And again, the boldest of the cats would start taking advantage of that, and there'd be this back and forth, and next thing you know, you have the domestic cat. That is the standard vision of how domestication occurred in the Fertile Crescent, and it makes sense. Now, I need to have a proviso here, and that is that species can hang around us without becoming domesticated. They can take advantage of our presence, but that doesn't mean they're domesticated. Think of all these animals that occur perhaps in your backyards. They are adapting to our presence in a way that's good for them, but raccoons are not becoming domesticated, or opossums. So something more has to happen. And to do that, I'd like to briefly talk about what domestication is. And it turns out there are lots of different definitions, but I'm just going to define domestication as the process by which animals and plants are modified by their interactions with humans in a way that benefits us. And by modified, I mean they have evolved through genetic changes that result in differences in their behavior, their physiology, or their anatomy, or something like that. And so this is evolution. Domestication is as much evolution as any other sort of genetic change. It's just one that is done in the presence of humans. And I mention this because I want to contrast this with what a tame animal is. And a tame animal is just an animal that has been usually raised from when it was young, and as a result will live around us and be okay with us and won't attack us and freak out. And many animals can be tamed, but biologically or genetically, they are no different from other members of their species. They are not domesticated. It's just their growing up experience that affects them. And so, for example, you can tame a wolf. I don't recommend it, but they're much nicer to be around than a wild wolf. But that is not the same as a dog. Dogs are genetically changed in many different ways. And the reason I tell you this will become apparent in a moment. So, where exactly did cat domestication occur? We know it's somewhere in the Fertile Crescent region. The traditional view is that it occurred in Egypt about 3,500 years ago. And that's because at that time, we start seeing on tomb walls and in other places portrayals of cats that clearly were in a domestic setting. They were eating food out of a bowl from underneath the dinner table. They were wearing collars. They were often sitting in the laps of the woman of the house. At that point, they seemed very likely to have been domesticated. And so many people say that that's when domestication occurred, when and where Egypt, 1500 BC. The other major candidate is the region around Turkey. And that is suggested for two reasons. One is Turkish people are crazy about cats. They sometimes refer to Istanbul as Catstanbul. And perhaps you've seen the movie that came out a few years ago, Kedi, about cats in Istanbul. It's a wonderful film. I highly recommend it. But there's also a more serious reason why that area is said to be the place where they were domesticated. And that comes from the nearby island of Cypress and from an archaeological finding from 10,000 years ago. This is a grave of a person on Cypress, and this person was buried with a lot of treasured tools and polished jewelry type objects and so on. And in addition, at this person's feet, there was another shallow grave of something else. And that something else, hard to see in the picture, but the diagram with the paper shows, it was a 9-month-old kitten, a 9-month-old cat. And the way that it was laid out very carefully, and it was put in a little grave covered up, suggests that it was a treasured possession or a friend as well. And so some people have interpreted this as saying that cats were domesticated 10,000 years ago in the region around Cyprus. The problem with this interpretation is the fact that you cannot tell based on the skeleton the difference between an African wild cat and a domestic cat. Even today, you can't tell based on the skeleton. So was this a domestic cat or was it a tame African wildcat? African wildcats today are very easy to tame. So we don't know. Perhaps this is evidence of domestication, but perhaps it's just the beginning stages of some cats hanging around. So domestication occurred somewhere between Egypt and Turkey, somewhere between 3,500 and 10,000 years ago. And at the moment, that's as much as we know. And it may be hard to find out more. Although some scientists, who I will mention in a moment, are trying to look at the DNA to look for the DNA changes that are signatures of domestication. I'm getting ahead of myself. What happened after this? Well, the archaeological and historical record answers that. They moved up to Greece very quickly into Greece, from Greece to Rome. Then they moved with the Roman Empire throughout much of Europe. From there, they got into Britain and then into North America and Australia and so on. This pattern, based on history, is being studied now by a Belgian. He was a graduate student at the time. He's continuing the work as a postdoc, looking at what's called ancient DNA. And what he was doing is he went to archaeological sites throughout this region and found where they have cat remains, and he was trying to extract the DNA from these ancient cats. Some of them as old as 10,000 years ago, some of them much more recent, to see whether the genetic data would chart their diaspora through the world. And so here's just a graph showing the age across the top. Some of these ones fairly recent, but many of them 1,000 years or even multiple thousands of years old. So he he got the DNA from many of these ancient specimens and tried to use the DNA to map their progression. Now, when this paper first came out, the results went viral. It captured the world's interest. And I had assumed that the reason people get excited was this. One of the things he sequenced were cat mummies, which the Egyptians made. Here's some from the British Museum in London. For reasons I won't get into too much, the Egyptians made millions of cat mummies that they worshipped the cat god as their major god for a time, and then perversely they killed millions of cats to make them as votive offerings. And so these cat mummies were so abundant in archaeological finds that for a while they were collected up and shipped to Britain to be used as fertilizer. There's one shipment of 19 tons of cat mummies. So in any case, Ottoni was able to get DNA out of some of these cat mummies. I thought this is what would go viral, but that wasn't it. Would anyone want to guess what went viral? No reason you should know, really. Viking cats. Memes such as this appeared just all over the place after this paper came out. And it had to do with this, that one of his study sites was the German town of Ralsvik, or however that's pronounced, from 700 AD. It's on the Baltic Sea. At that time, it was a Viking village. And so he had cat remains from there, and he sequenced the DNA. And the standard view from what I just told you is that the cats would have reached northern Germany as the Roman Empire spread in that way. But his results suggested something else, that the DNA of the Ralsvik cats were very similar to the ones down from Egypt. And that suggested that the Vikings in their longships had gone all the way around Europe through the Mediterranean, picked up some cats and brought them back to Germany. Now, they probably didn't go there to get the cats, but you know, when you go there, you grab some or they hop on the ship or so on. And then, in fact, it was suggested that once they were there, the Vikings took them to England, to Iceland and islands around there, and perhaps even to North America. So that's what got the press so excited about that. So that's their diaspora into Europe and North America and so on. In addition, the archaeological record shows us there's a site in the, is that the Red Sea or the Dead Sea there? Anyway, there's a site there, and they clearly took the shipping route to India. In addition, they hopped on the Silk Road, and we can see the spread based on evidence from these places, and that's how they got to Asia. So finally, I'm going to talk about the last part of my talk, the future of cats. Where are they headed? And one of the most exciting things is looking at the DNA, as I mentioned a moment ago. And perhaps the most exciting initiative is something called the 99 Lives Cat Genome Sequencing Initiative. It's being run out of the University of Missouri in Columbia, which is a couple hours drive from where I am in St. Louis. And it's being led by the world's premier cat geneticist, the aptly named Leslie Lyons. And so she has been sequencing the genome of cats now for a number of years. And the primary reason she's been doing that is trying to find the genetic basis of diseases that cats have, much as people are doing that with humans. And just to give you an example, the first disease that she tackled was something called polycystic kidney disease. And this is a malady that afflicts both cats and people. It causes the formation of cysts in the kidney and elsewhere, which lead to enlargement of the kidney and ultimately kidney failure and death. And it's a leading cause of death in cats. And originally, when this work was conducted, 38% of Persian cats developed PKD. And Persian cats at that time were the most popular breed of cats, so it made it the most important genetic disease in cats. Well, she identified the mutation in a particular gene that caused PKD, and we can't understate the significance of this finding, because first, people could screen their cats and find out, is the cat going to develop PKD? And if they are, you could immediately start prophylactic measures, feed them the right diets and so on, that would help delay the onset of the disease. More importantly, of course, you could make sure you didn't breed those cats. And that's what people did. They would run a test, and if your cat had the mutation, you simply didn't breed it. And the results have been dramatic. The prevalence of the disease has now dropped almost closing in on zero, thanks to this genetic finding. And I should point out there are benefits to humans because humans get PKD as well. And that if I understand correctly, a diet that was developed in part because of this genetic work for cats is now being used on people to see if it might be effective. And it goes both ways. Well, there are many other cat genetic diseases or conditions. For example, this cat here it's a new breed called the Munchkin. And I think you can figure out why. And it's due to a single mutation that causes the legs to be very short. This same mutation occurs in humans, or a similar mutation in the same gene. And I will point out that this cat actually is very healthy, that we might call this the corgi of cats. But corgis and dachshunds have a lot of problems because their spine wasn't meant to be supported by little legs. Cats are built differently, and it's actually okay for them, although many people just don't like them. But in any case, by studying the genetics of this condition in cats, there may be implications for humans. And finally, I should note that these ideas have been commercialized. There are a number of different companies that you can buy tests to screen your cat for many different genetic conditions. And an important thing to know is all of this work that has been commercialized by these companies is a result of what Leslie Lyons and some other colleagues have done. And it's such a great example of how basic research then can actually have commercial implications. So that's one aspect in which the future will be genomically based for cats. And there's much else you can learn from this genome information about their history, what are the genes responsible for differences in behavior, and so on. But I want to conclude with a question more closer to my own heart in terms of my research, and that is, are cats evolving today? And in particular, feral cats. As you may know, cats now exist as feral populations on every continent in the world except Antarctica. And I'm not referring to the cats that are unowned cats that live in Cambridge and almost every city that people are feeding that still interact with people, but there are truly wild populations. And these populations are experiencing many extreme conditions different from their ancestral, where the African wildcat came from. So for example, in Australia, there are species in the heart of the outback where it is blazing hot and there's very little water. On the other hand, they occur in the mountains of Tasmania, which is very temperate and very cold. And I would wager that, well, one of the things we now know is that evolution can occur very rapidly when conditions change. This is something that Darwin didn't tell us, that he was actually mistaken about this, but in the recent decades, we've realized that natural selection can rapidly produce evolutionary change. So the question we might ask is, are cats evolving to the new conditions in which they live? And one other condition, just to mention it, many cats occur on isolated islands in the Pacific Ocean and so on, where there are no predators. And as a result, they are tackling prey such as big seabirds that they've never attacked before. But the seabirds are naive to their presence, and so they're having a new sort of predation way. Again, a different selective pressure. So no one has studied so far, are feral cats evolving? I think they almost surely are. And in fact, this is a topic that I've started doing research on myself. I'd never expected to become a cat scientist when I started writing this book, but now I am. And this is one of the questions I'm asking. There is some reason to think, there is some evidence of feral cats evolving, and that has to do with this guy here, the black panther, or black leopard. It turns out that there are many black leopards in Asia living in the rainforest there, and in fact, 14 species of felines are known to have black individuals in them, and when they've been examined, almost all of those are species that live in dark forests. And so the idea is that black coloration may evolve adaptively in wild feline species to live in forested or otherwise dark conditions. Well, that raises the question, what about feral cat populations living in forests? Will they evolve to be black cats? Well, we don't know, but there is some suggestive evidence. This animal here, this is taken by what's called a camera trap, a remotely triggered camera set up in the forest from Madagascar. And all of a sudden, this long-legged black creature was found in a place in northwestern Madagascar. And people at first thought it was a new species of feline that had never been studied before, but they managed to capture some, and it's just a domestic cat that has evolved to be all black. So the question is this a general phenomenon? Are they evolving for different colors and different habitat types? And that's, well, my prediction is yes, but we will find out. And finally, I want to conclude by asking just what is the deep future of cats? And what I mean by that is, as we all know, humans are messing up the world in many ways, but eventually we'll stop, and hopefully we won't destroy the entire planet. And there have been mass extinctions before, and life always recovers. The question that we don't know is what will be left when we finally, when we turn things around. Will there be tigers? Will there be ocelots? We can hope so, but most species of felines are today endangered at some level, or at least threatened. Maybe they'll survive, maybe they won't. But one feline we know will survive, and that is the domestic cat. By some estimates, there are 1 billion cats in the world today, of which maybe 300 to 400 million are feral and the rest are live with or around people. As I said, they're on every continent except Antarctica. They occur in many islands, so they're experiencing many different environments. And we can just look to what's happened historically. The first small spotted cat arrived in South America 3 million years ago. It's produced actually 8 different species that live there today. Or Proilurus, a little bit longer, 30 million years ago. Well, it's left 42 descendant species today. So I think that it is safe to conclude that in the future, there will be felines around, and probably most of them will be descendants of the domestic cat. Will they just evolve to be just like these, or will they go in new directions? Will saber-toothed cats re-evolve? Well, wait a few tens of thousands of years and we'll find out. But I hope at least in some way it's an encouraging sign that the world will have cats forevermore. I guarantee it. And with that, I just want to show you one thing that I find amusing. This is my book, the American version. The British have a very different cover and a very different title. It's exactly the same book. And the reason they have a different title, and we can ask Andrew if this is true, but in Britain, the phrase, the cat's meow, something that's good, they don't know it as that. It means nothing. And so when the British publishers are told the cat's meow, like this is a book about meowing, and so they came up with a different title. So with that, I do want to remind you that next month is National Cat Day. Please celebrate appropriately, and thank you so much for coming out today.